Could Canada stop a US invasion today? It sounds absurd. The US military is the most powerful on Earth, but tensions between the two countries have been rising lately, with even President Trump calling for Canada to become the 51st state. Canadians, not so into that idea. Some have even raised the possibility of war to protect their sovereignty. And while most would assume the US would steamroll its northern neighbor, history suggests otherwise. Back in 1812, the United States tried to invade Canada. On paper, it should have been easy. Even Thomas Jefferson called it
a mere matter of marching.
He was wrong. The invasion turned into a national embarrassment. The Americans were outmaneuvered, outmatched, and pushed back hard. In this video, we're breaking down the real story of that failed invasion and what it might say about the US and Canada today. Does this war from over 200 years ago tell us anything about a potential conflict now? Let's get into it. To understand why the US tried to take Canada, you've got to rewind to the early 1800s. The US was still a young nation, flexing its muscles, eager to expand, and constantly getting pushed around by global powers. The biggest issue, the British Royal Navy. Britain was desperate to maintain naval dominance in its war with France, and its navy was short on sailors. So British ships began stopping American vessels, searching them, and forcibly conscripting sailors. It enraged the American public. But that wasn't the only reason Congress went to war. A group of aggressive politicians, known as the War Hawks, wanted more. They wanted to secure American pride, crush native resistance, and maybe even grab new territory. Their eyes turned north, to Canada. The logic was simple. Britain was distracted in Europe. Canada was lightly defended. And they believed Canadians would actually welcome US troops as liberators. In 1812, the United States declared war on one of the most powerful empires in the world, Great Britain. At first glance, it seems like a mismatch. Britain had a massive navy, global reach, and was locked in a brutal war with Napoleon in Europe. The US, barely 3 decades into independence, had a small standing army and almost no navy to speak of. But American leaders believed they had reason and opportunity on their side. The plan was to invade, seize land, and force Britain to the bargaining table while they were distracted fighting Napoleon in Europe. A miscalculation from the start. This plan was built on faulty assumptions. Canadians, by and large, didn't want to become Americans. The British military, while smaller, was better trained and better led. Indigenous Americans allied with Canada and the British, and the US Army, underfunded, poorly trained, and led by aging Revolutionary War veterans or inexperienced political appointees. Still, in June 1812, the United States was going to take the fight to Canada and expected it to be over quickly. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first time America invaded Canada and got wrecked was in the northwest frontier, modern-day Michigan. The idea was to strike early, take Upper Canada, what's now Ontario, and build momentum. The man tasked with this, General William Hull. A Revolutionary War veteran and the governor of Michigan Territory, Hull had experience, but little interest in this war. He was nearly 60, cautious by nature, and found himself leading a poorly trained, poorly supplied force. But by July 1812, he was marching toward Canada with about 2,000 troops, mostly volunteers and state militia. The objective, cross the Detroit River and take the nearby town of Sandwich just across the border. On July 12, 1812, Hull and his men crossed into Canadian territory. Morale was high, and resistance was minimal at first. But Hull hesitated. Instead of pressing forward, he stopped. He feared that, without secure supply lines or reinforcements, his men would be cut off deep in enemy territory. So, after just a few days, he ordered a retreat, back to Detroit. That decision would set the tone for what came next. British General Isaac Brock, commander of forces in Upper Canada, wasn't about to let an American army sit unchallenged across the river. He teamed up with Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who was building a powerful native confederacy to resist US expansion. Tecumseh was a skilled tactician, and his warriors knew the land better than anyone. Together, they moved quickly to surround Detroit. What followed was one of the greatest bluffs in military history. Tecumseh staged his warriors to march in loops through the forest, creating the illusion of a massive native force. Brock sent a letter to Hull, warning that he couldn't control his native allies if a battle broke out. A thinly veiled threat of massacre. British artillery began bombarding the fort, not heavily, but just enough to unnerve the Americans. Inside the fort, panic spread. Civilians had taken shelter. Hull, fearing slaughter, especially of women and children, was already on edge. On August 16, 1812, without firing a single musket, General Hull surrendered the entire fort and the city of Detroit to a much smaller British and native force. In doing so, he handed over 2,500 troops, dozens of cannons, vast amounts of weapons and supplies, and the entire Michigan territory. It was one of the most complete and humiliating defeats in American military history. News of the surrender rocked the nation. Hull was court-martialed and convicted of cowardice and neglect of duty. President Madison pardoned him, citing his service in the Revolutionary War, but his career was over. The British now controlled the upper Midwest and gained momentum, and Native American allies saw it as proof that the US could be beaten. Instead of conquering Canada, the United States had lost ground on its own soil. After the debacle at Detroit, the US was desperate for a win. If they could still take Upper Canada from the east, across the Niagara River, it might salvage public opinion and reignite momentum. The new plan was to cross into Canada at Queenston, a small village on the river just opposite Lewiston, New York. The goal was to capture the high ground known as Queenston Heights, giving the US control over a strategic portion of the region. It started with promise, but like much of the US strategy in this war, it fell apart from the inside. The man in charge was General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a member of one of New York's wealthiest families. He was a militia general, not a professional soldier, and had no combat experience. The US Army and the state militias didn't get along. Coordination was a mess, and Van Rensselaer was caught between federal orders and local resistance from his own troops. Still, on October 13th, 1812, he launched the assault. Before dawn, American troops began ferrying across the river in small boats. They took heavy fire from British and Canadian forces, but managed to land and climb a steep path up the escarpment, a trail discovered by a local guide. At the top, they captured Queenston Heights, including a British artillery position. It was a major win. But here's where it unraveled. The boats carrying reinforcements were slow and disorganized. Some were damaged or lost. And worst of all, New York militia troops on the US side refused to cross. They claimed their enlistments were for defensive service only, not to fight on foreign soil. Van Rensselaer pleaded with them. His officers begged, but hundreds of armed men stood on the banks and watched the battle from a distance, unwilling to fight. Meanwhile, the American troops on the heights were stranded, cut off, and outnumbered. British General Isaac Brock, the same commander who helped take Detroit, rushed to the scene. He personally led an assault to retake the heights and was shot and killed early in the fighting. But his forces, now led by General Roger Hale Sheaffe, regrouped. They were reinforced by British regulars, Canadian militia, and Mohawk warriors who launched a full counterattack. Outnumbered and unsupported, the US troops on the heights were surrounded and overwhelmed. By the end of the day, over 900 American soldiers surrendered. The death of Isaac Brock was a blow to British leadership, but his defense of Canada made him a national hero. Stephen Van Rensselaer, disillusioned and humiliated, resigned within days. The battle made it clear US militia forces couldn't be relied on, and the plan to take Canada by sheer willpower wasn't working. Instead of a rallying victory, Queenston Heights became yet another lesson in poor planning, divided leadership, and unrealistic expectations. By 1813, the US campaign to conquer Canada was stalled. Every attempt to push north had failed or backfired. The army was undertrained. The militias were unreliable. The leadership was inconsistent at best. And while there were a few American victories, like the naval win on Lake Erie and General William Henry Harrison's victory at the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed, public support wavered. But in 1814, everything changed. For the first 2 years of the war, Britain had been tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe. But by spring 1814, Napoleon had been defeated, at least for the moment. That freed up thousands of British troops and warships. They sent many straight to North America. Suddenly, the British had the upper hand, and they used it. In late summer 1814, British forces landed in Chesapeake Bay and marched on the US capital. American defenders were caught off guard. The British met little resistance at Bladensburg, Maryland, and pushed straight into Washington, D.C. There, they set fire to the Capitol building, burned the White House, torched nearly every government building in the city. It was the first and only time a foreign power has occupied and burned the U.S. Capitol. The message was clear. The British could strike deep into American territory, and they weren't bluffing. Ironically, a hurricane and tornado hit the city shortly after, helping extinguish the flames and scattering British forces, but the damage to American morale was done. By late 1814, both sides were tired of fighting. Britain was spending heavily and gaining little. The US was facing bankruptcy and political divisions. No territory had changed hands in any meaningful way. On December 24, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war. The treaty restored all territorial boundaries to pre-war lines, didn't address impressment or maritime rights, the main causes of the war, didn't resolve anything with Native American nations, many of whom lost land and alliances as a result. In short, the war ended exactly where it began. So, back to the question we started with, could Canada stop an invasion by the United States today? Occupying Canada wouldn't be like taking territory in a vacuum. It would be vast, rugged, inhospitable, and heavily urbanized in key regions. Canada has thousands of miles of wilderness ideal for guerrilla warfare, harsh terrain and weather that can cripple unprepared troops. A population that, in this scenario, would be deeply hostile to US forces. Even in 1812, with all its logistical and military weaknesses, Canada held its ground through strategy, alliances, and determination. That spirit hasn't gone anywhere. Now let's talk geopolitics. If the US invaded Canada today, NATO would be torn apart. Canada is a founding member. Allies would turn against the US diplomatically, economically, and possibly militarily. China and Russia would exploit the chaos. Global trade routes would collapse, especially in energy, finance, and food exports. The US would face massive economic sanctions and possibly internal rebellion. So even if the US military could take Canadian ground, it would likely lose far more in global power, legitimacy, and stability. Even just holding major cities would turn into a nightmare occupation for any invader. History proves it. Holding territory where you're not welcome bleeds armies dry. If you're asking whether Canada could prevent US troops from entering, probably not. But if you're asking whether it could stop the US from succeeding, from holding territory, from claiming victory, absolutely. It would be a political, strategic, and economic disaster for the United States and possibly the end of its global leadership. In the end, the lesson from 1812 still applies. Invading Canada might seem easy until you try it. History doesn't repeat, but it does echo. In 1812, the United States underestimated Canada and paid the price. Today, the stakes are far higher, the weapons more devastating, and the consequences far-reaching. Invading Canada isn't just a bad idea, it's probably impossible to win. What do you think? Let me know in the comments and let's continue the discussion. If you like this breakdown, hit the like and subscribe for more forgotten history and real-world what-ifs.